Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. Welcome to part 3 of my interview with Brian Nuckols on the philosophy of dreams. Though it is not strictly necessary to listen to the first 2 parts in order to understand this final part, I do recommend it. You can find them at williamnava.podbean.com. So now that we've kind of gone through some of the history of all this, I kind of want to talk about some specific things about dreams that to me seem to point at some interesting ideas about metaphysics. Okay. So one is something that you touched on when you were describing your dream, which is the dream within the dream phenomenon, right? So that's something that certainly happens to people. And even more than it happening to people, it's just a really prevalent thing in culture, just the thing that people really associate with dreams. It's like a major cliche in movies, right? Any movie that has a dream is probably going to try to make it a dream within a dream because but I find it really interesting because it seems obvious to me that when you're in a dream, you are in a you're in like a different kind of reality. And it's like when you go to sleep, you go to this other world. Now, putting aside the ontology of that, that's just kind of, a sort of simple way of interpreting what's going on. You go to this other world. And the fact that in that other world, what often happens is that you go to other worlds and this sort of recursive thing continues to happen. It seems to suggest to me that there's something, either about the psyche or about the world or about both that dreams are pointing to, which is that they actually sort of work in this kind of recursive way. Like, this is obviously a leap, right? There's not a very strong argument for this. It's really more of an intuition, but I can't help but have the intuition that because dreams exist, and I know they exist and I've had them.
Yes.
It seems fairly plausible to me that life, what seems to me regular life, is a dream of something else. Not exactly a dream of something else, right? But something like a dream of something else. Have you ever had, I don't know, does that make any sense to you?
Well, it kind of reminds me of, this Runa idea of the acorn being a dream of the tree, or the tree being a dream of the acorn. And in some ways, we are kind of a dream of the bang, right? Like space, which I think is interesting because a lot of old mythology has the kind of the world created from the death of like a dragon or something. I've always found that creation myth particularly fascinating. I like this. So for recurring dreams, like I've always looked at it kind of, we talked about the archetypes, right? The collective. I've always kind of looked at it as kind of an epiphenomenon of dreams, as kind of a conversational flavor, if you will, of like particular things that are playing out in my life. Like, so like, it seems to me that my dreams, and I'm pretty rigorous about, there's this term in phenomenology, like modern phenomenology, called unverified personal gnosis, which is like, this happened to me. It's not a truth claim, but I'm fairly rigorous about keeping my dream, or keeping a dream journal. And it seems to me that like reoccurring dreams and dreams within dreams are kind of epiphenomenal in the sense that particular aspects of my life seem to be related to that phenomenon, right? So particular things that I'm working on or that I'm interested in contort to these specific phenomena specifically. So when I have this dream, I know I interpret it as related to X particular thing. Now, yeah. And so to me, they seem to be they seem conversational to me. It's like I recognize the flavor of this dream almost. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a little abstract.
It does make sense.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in interpreting uh, um, recurring dreams and sort of tropes about dreams on a social level, and to see what that sort of tells us. So in terms of the dream within the dream having this implication of metaphysical recursion, I kind of see that in lots of places actually, and I wonder if is that a thing about the world? Is that a thing about the society I live in? Is that a thing about just how I tend to interpret things? But
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
one thing it kind of reminds me of is are you familiar with like the simulation hypothesis?
Yes.
All right. So I don't know. That's just like another example that just seems to have the same structure. This idea that like inevitably there are sort of copies of us within us, and we are ourselves a copy of some larger thing. This idea of sort of synecdoches within synecdoches.
Yes. Well, what I like about it is it does kind of that idea. Like it is kind of interesting with some of the earlier models as and a lot of fiction writers talk about this too, interestingly enough, like people who seem to be engaging with the unconscious. And this is kind of a quintessential Gnostic idea, is that experience of the divine isn't creation is, dreaming is a remembering, not a creation. I think that's really interesting. So like what you're talking about is recursion. It does make sense on a biological level that you kind of ignore that. Like we have to do work, like we have to like live in the world. We have to reproduce and live. So we kind of have this structure that blinds us to things, like, and that's useful. And so it does make sense to me in a dream, like, so this idea of recursion being kind of at the fabric of reality, it would make sense that you would engage with that in dreams. And it would be, and I think that is a very good hypothesis to why, because we're getting more data on this though, but like, so myth isn't distributed randomly, like I said it is. So myth does not seem to be, like, I don't think you can make a lazy psychological unconscious, collective unconscious argument for myth, like why the lunar goddess is always a woman, because it's actually not true, and it's not randomly distributed. But recurring dreams do seem to be. They like people about like, for example, the one that I'm really fascinated with is being late to like school. Well, like for the Runa have dreams about missing their initiation ceremony. Like they show up late to it.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Into adulthood. Like you go, I think it's 7 or 8. And they'll report that, and they'll like go to the shaman and chat about it. And it's because they have a pretty, they have a structure of what you're to do. It's not as complicated, right? Like there's not as many roles. So like as a 38-year-old woman, if you're having a dream about that, the interpretation's a lot. If the shaman hasn't, let's say, an easier time interpreting, it's like, what are you nervous about in the next role as like a 50-year-old woman? That's kind of their interpretation. It's more clear cut, perhaps. But that's really fascinating. So I think it is intriguing to me and I'll definitely look at that more, that you're kind of maybe engaging. It could be a more universal experience that has to do with recursion. And Nietzsche too. Yeah.
So I have some recurring dreams, and then there also seem to be very popular recurring dreams. So one that I don't have, but I hear is, seems to like be a very popular one, is like falling, right? That's such a common, like people have the dream of falling all the time. Another kind of cliche one is losing your teeth. So this one is also very popular, and this one I have as well. I've had a whole bunch of losing my teeth dreams. They're terrifying. So I mean, just to kind of like play a little bit with some just kind of examples, like what do you make of the fact that those, for example, those two dreams happen to be popular in our society? What is that? What would you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think those are two perfect ones, because I think that they're quintessentially two fundamental human tensions that Freud touched on. And so the teeth, I mean, I really associate that with the first tension in the baby's life. And it's the fact that to eat, it must hurt its mother. The breastfeeding is very painful, and babies, see that, right? They see the mother pulling away and kind of suffering through feeding it. And I think that's a fundamental human tension, is that life is this kind of process of killing and like if your cells don't die correctly, like you'll get cancer. Like that's bad, right? Like if death isn't working, that's existentially like pretty shitty and terrifying. And I think that's I think the teeth falling out is kind of this experience of that, of this kind of a regression to the oral phase, and like of trying to come to terms with that, which is not easy at all. And then I think falling is the same way, is something similar, is that, and there's a great book called The Ecological Interpretation to Visual Perception, which is a little dense, but I suggest it because, and I should say I do kind of come from this school of phenomenology. It's like I'm pretty enchanted by that, and I think this is a really, so when you see a cliff, you don't see a cliff. Like the attributes of the cliff are primary to the human. So you see a falling off place first. That's what happens. So you see the result, like and how we say that is because of like fear response. Like those parts of the brain are activated first when seeing a cliff before we get to the prefrontal cortex, which is like putting everything together miraculously and calling it a cliff. Anyways, I mean, that must come through, like, how does that happen? Like we had a lot of, like, let's talk about the snake. Like you don't see a snake, you see danger. Or you don't see a mouse, you see, and the mouse example is interesting because it depends if you see danger or not. It depends on the first time. Like if you see a mouse run across the floor, the baby looks at the mom or the dad. And then from that face, it interprets danger or not danger, and then kind of encodes that, which is really interesting because it does. Yeah. And so how I interpret the falling is this kind of grief about, or this kind of reality of a kind of Darwinian reality in some ways. In like with the snake, I think it's a good example. Like they found out that like lemurs don't have good eyesight because there's no snakes on Madagascar, or the part of Madagascar they live on. Your vision is far more acute where there's high snake density. And so with that, from a biological standpoint, that means we've had a lot of humans that have like kind of been eaten, the chimps, to develop this level of eyesight. And so I always look at those tensions when seeing those kind of dreams. Like, can we kind of come to terms with that reality and find a way to like kind of love that fate, like to go back to Nietzsche, or kind of take a Camus approach to it? That's kind of my approach to dealing with that. Those two in particular, but they are absolutely widespread. And I think it makes sense because those are two tough realities to deal with.
That's interesting.
Now, let me just talk about dream interpretation really quick. So like what I did there was kind of an example of cluster thinking, right? So if we were doing analysis, that's what we would try to flesh out of people, and they could come up with a different one. And I think, yeah, it could be interesting to develop models of how something can be right in dream interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of like, I recently was listening to something by Karl Popper.
Yes. Okay.
And he said that the sign of the way you know something is a pseudoscience is that if it's not falsifiable. And his example actually was Freudian psychoanalysis. He said, there's nothing that we can find out that will show us that psychoanalysis is wrong. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that? The sort of the sort of skeptical view that says, this stuff may be overly interesting, but because it's not falsifiable, there's not, we have no way of knowing if it's just like the imagination of some rather creative people as opposed to something actually substantial.
I mean, I actually, and this might come as a surprise to a lot of people, but I think I would define myself inherently as a skeptic. But that has to be evenly distributed, like across domains. So Karl Popper, like he developed one of the proofs for, like he created this really interesting way to look at quantum mechanics, didn't he? Like a certain experiment.
If he did, I'm not familiar with it.
My point there is I'm kind of trying to do a sick burn. Is like you can't verify string theory. It's unverifiable. Yet that we seem to be able to make like really interesting technology with that requires quantum mechanics to at least be useful. Like, and I'm not an expert on this, but I guess it would be kind of a pragmatic approach. It's like, perhaps, I think that's right, but I think even Karl Popper, like going back to my kind of quip about Aristotle, like I think there is a jump to the unverifiable everywhere. I have not been convinced that there is of something being verified that I'm really convinced by. And yet I love my computer that is doing this. It's really useful to me. So I'm not going to diss physics, right? And I think it's the same with psychoanalysis. But in that vein, I think I would like to see more rigor. And the kind of metaphor I would use is like, so there's this field that I've done. So like in a business context, like if you're spending money to increase revenue, there's so many factors that go into that. It's almost impossible. There's a famous advertising pioneer that said, I forget his name, that half of my advertising budget is wasted. I'm just not sure which half. And I think that can be similar for psychoanalysis, right? Like, but what I try to do is, I think it's useful to say, so I mentioned about how I interpreted my reoccurring dreams. I think it's useful to compartmentalize things in life and like try to create a more rigorous empirical experiment. Like, can I make $2,000, let's say, and can I interpret do lucid dreaming. So can I run an experiment where, I try to incubate that kind of process? So I think we can create smaller structure for something like, let's say, self-actualization. Okay, we're not going to be able to verify that. I would say that if someone, like there are measures like with self-reporting, like did you have a better day yesterday than you did yesterday? I think those are reasonably okay to use. What's interesting is in like modern, I talked at the beginning about how I was discouraged by the results that are out there. Like now, no answer for major depressive disorder. No answer. Very poor, worse than baseball hitters, and a lot more. A lot of money pumped into it. Very hard to replicate things, and they've shown that just talking to like a college counselor or even a friend is almost as the results of therapy might just be in the talking itself, and the training could be irrelevant. I mean, you could make a very good argument there. So I would say to Popper is like, yes, I agree completely, but like we still have depression to deal with. We still have that to deal with. So, I think I think these kind of alternate means should be explored until I'm convinced that we have another way to comfort the afflicted.
Yeah, I like one thing I like about Popper is that he talks about falsification instead of verification, and so I think that the fact that the results of psychoanalysis and some of the stuff that you're talking about are there, right? That you see from self-reporting some level of success shows us that there's something there. Now, you might have all kinds of different interpretations about what it is that it, maybe the sort of, we've been talking about kind of ontological interpretations, right? So like maybe the ontological interpretations involved are totally off, but the techniques that we associate are doing the right thing. And I think, like you said, if you add a little bit of rigor, you can usually kind of create more experiments to narrow down your range of which ontological interpretations are really going to fit. I doubt that we can ever, I agree with you that I don't think we can ever, say, okay, we have shown and proven that this is the correct ontological interpretation. Because I think there's always going to be there's always going to be more than one ontological interpretation that can be conjured up that'll fit with the data. So,
and to make a quick, let's say a quick libertarian point here is, I see a major problem is there's not a market for depression, right? Like it's completely tied to the insurance industry, completely. And I would love the opportunity to work more. When I was abroad, because there's just no mental health there, I got to work with refugees and from Haiti, and I got to work with people who had terrible abuse situations going on. Like I can't work with them in the States. Like, well, there's the financial barrier for them because they're just going to go with their insurance, but you can actually, get legal trouble for it, which I think is unfortunate if the results are so poor, as it's been shown again and again. So I do just want to kind of get on my high horse there because I think that's ridiculous. And I think it would be useful to get more data and try different modalities when there aren't good results. I think that's kind of standard how we've done things as humans, and it's not the case in psychoanalysis at all. So yeah, quick.
Yeah. While we're on the topic, I've talked to you about the Landmark, this program that I've done before.
Yes.
And I have a lot of problems with the program in general, but one thing that I've always been struck by ever since that I did it is it's just the empirical results. It's just the number of people that report a dramatic improvement in the quality of their lives. And the sort of techniques being used are what amount to a kind of like applied existentialism.
Yeah.
With all kinds of I don't know, bits taking from like it's a kind of a hodgepodge of different traditions that they borrow from. I think mostly a combination of existentialism and Zen Buddhism. But
well, from the research I've done, there's a little bit of Freud in there with the flooding. That was a key part of Freudian psychoanalysis that I didn't mention, is this kind of flooding of emotion, like just kind of amplifying negative emotion. And I read about that. Landmark has a similar process, right? Kind of amplify things.
There's an exercise which they call the I don't think they call it this, but I think it's just informally referred to this, the fear exercise.
Yeah. Okay.
Where you kind of close your eyes and meditate on your sort of physical experience while you imagine. Basically, they amplify a sense of fear in you and have you focus on and imagine moments of fear and discomfort and powerlessness and sort of everyone around you being against you, this sort of thing. And you get a really sort of a very like visceral sense of
really interesting
of fear, actually. And there's this it's an interesting exercise. There's a kind of cathartic punchline to it, which is that mostly what I find and what I think most people find is that what you're afraid of is other people.
Yes.
You're afraid that other people are going to judge you, hurt you, whatever it may be. And the kind of really cathartic punchline I'm just always struck by how effective this is that you realize that everybody around you when you're doing in this program is at that exact same moment equally afraid of you. Right? So you're sort of afraid of everybody around you while you're going through this experience, and then you realize, oh, all these other people around me are afraid of me as well. And then there's a kind of very powerful cathartic release that comes with that.
It's really interesting. It reminds me of this one experience I had where I had to get out. I'd been in too long, and I was like, I went to, essentially, I won't go into the gory details, but I went to a Zumba class, dancing, and I had terrible fear of dancing. And they were like, that was like an overcoming. I had to go do this. I just felt like I had to do it. I was just so terrified. And the instructor like sniffed that out and came up to me and was like, hey, every single person here is completely fixated on how they look right now and are completely, like, I don't think she said unconscious, but they're not looking at you. Like, you don't have to worry about that. Like, they're like how fixated you are and self-conscious. Every single person here is like that. And that was like, I had a cathartic release from that. It was fairly profound. I was like, and I had a really fun rest of the night. Like, dancing is actually extremely fun, which I didn't know before that. Right. Yeah. And so I think that's an interesting technique there. Yeah.
Well, what I find interesting about the whole thing is that, and again, there's definitely some sort of, I don't know, questionable things about Landmark, to put it that way, and that's a subject for a different day. But that some of the techniques they're using seem to be incredibly effective, and yet they're discredited. There's not a great deal of research or sort of empirical research about their effectiveness, and there's not a great deal of rigor around actually identifying exactly what it is that makes things like that effective. Whereas the sort of mainstream of CBT and pharmacology, which has its, has its place, but you talked about earlier, it generally is actually not that effective. So if we're talking about just like, hey, let's be empirical and scientifically minded, what is actually the sort of mainstream of therapeutic practice doesn't seem to have just basically great results. It may be studied more rigorously, but actually those studies don't seem to be all that promising.
And it can be even more grim. I think some of the attacks on, let's say, Jung, and actually I was just visiting, this is funny, I'll put this on camera. I was just visiting someone who'd been committed, and I brought him books, and they confiscated my Jung book. They wouldn't, the interpretation of dreams. They said this can't go in, which I thought was really, really funny. It really made me giggle. But I think that, like, we were talking about political forms of projection, and I think the crisis of replication errors, I think that kind of, like, you'll see like these people that are pharmacists who like are dedicated, like their lives are like they have online presences that are dedicated to like debunking, like, say, herbalism or say like alternative medicines. And it strikes me as really cruel in a lot of ways to like have to when you have like replication errors, spend energy doing like attacking, like, even if it's, let's say, placebo, like, people are finding solace in it. I don't see necessarily a problem. Like, if we also concurrently have, rigorous scientific, like, I think it's a problem if, let's say, we have very good evidence that this is more effective than X, and then you're like subjecting, say, a child to X. Like, I can see the problem there, but when you don't, I look at that as definitely a form of projection, and I think it's more grim, like would say CBT, which I'm really interested in, because primarily I want to see people who have suffering. I'd like to see that relieved in certain like cases that look like there's no hope. And there's this problem with publication bias where people don't publish results that aren't promising. So you kind of get this survivorship bias where the only the most promising studies get published, and then you do a meta-analysis on them, and it's discounting perhaps hundreds of studies that went nowhere. And as an individual person who's looking to get over, say, an eating disorder, it's pretty I would say, sadistic if there's perhaps landmark that could legitimately get you over that, and there's, say, the CBT that perhaps could get you over it, to like say you should only do the one, because if they're equally empirical, which they could be, I don't know, because it's hard for me to interpret as someone who's trying to be really probably overly rigorously empirical. I become like very open to alternatives, right? For something like landmark, or let's say dream analysis.
So let me shift to something else now. I want you to give a kind of intro how-to for people who are interested in. Well, I want to do a quick bit on both dream analysis and lucid dreaming. So take whichever one you want to try first.
Okay. Well, first, let me just say this, because I'll give you components to it, because like what I do is a lot of work, and people will kind of get turned off on it by it. But what I'll say is that dreaming is, on average, 30% of your life, and 25% of that is dreaming, and that's more than anything you're going to do. So I think it's worthwhile to. I wanted to preface with that. Like it kind of strikes me as funny that people are like willing to toss that away, and that's actually one of my critiques against the deflationary models. Like they tend to be Darwinian, and it seems to me ironic that such a large portion of our lives at a very vulnerable time would be dedicated to something that has no use. But anyways, I wanted to preface with that. The step one is definitely remembering your dreams. Whether it's going to be dream analysis or lucid dreaming, like we have to know we're in a dream. And so we have to start recognizing, and I'm going to say one thing about Marshall McLuhan real quick. Like, I think it's helpful to look at dreams as like a medium. And that's a big subject, but like what I want to get across is remembering your dreams is important, because we need to start recognizing dream life on its own terms. And if we're going to eventually obviously interpret our dreams, but eventually lucid dream, we have to get very comfortable in this kind of medium, like as comfortable as you would be, say, watching YouTube, or watching a movie. So yeah, remembering your dreams is step one, and it can be really difficult. Step one, easy win is like get REM sleep. We need REM sleep. So the more REM sleep, the better. 8 hours is optimal, not doable for everyone. But what you can do is there's these apps that say you can only get 4 hours of sleep, still wake up directly after your last REM cycle. So there's these one's called Sleepy, TIME. Like get that, and that's good because you also wake up more refreshed. Because if you wake up in the middle of a REM cycle, your body wants you to just finish that cycle. So, but if you wake up to step one, remembering your dreams, like the easy stuff is wake up at the end of a REM cycle, and you'll be far more likely to remember. Also, keep in mind the biology we were talking about earlier. So the prefrontal, it's essentially a race with the prefrontal cortex. So you want to put it into a form that likes, the prefrontal cortex likes, as soon as possible. So I look at language. As soon as I wake up, I've conditioned myself to start chattering about what I was dreaming about, which I always say, like, make sure you tell your partner that you're going to start doing this if you're sleeping with someone. So start getting freaked out if you're like doing this running surrealist commentary. As soon as you wake up, it can be pretty freakish. So yeah, that's what I do. I mean, the kind of classic is have a notebook, right? And I do have a notebook next to on my table, and I try to like roll over. As long as you verbalize it, though, you've essentially got it, in my experience, because you now have your prefrontal cortex can place language into your like short-term memory. It does not do well with whatever dreams are. Putting that in short-term memory doesn't like to encode that. So you want to get into words, and then I kind of summarize it. Then we have I use this app called Text Expander on the phone, on the computer. And so I won't go through the minutia of my morning, but as it kind of culminates with me getting ready to go to work with a cup of coffee and a computer. And I just have Google Docs open, and I click a hotkey, and it has this little prompt. And on the prompt, it has character, it has plot, it has setting, and it has conflict. And from my dream the last night, I do a 5 to 10 minute, depending on how intense the dream was, at least 5 minutes free write, where I incorporate all of those aspects into the dream. And that's kind of an autonomous, I look at that as, that's how I would go about interpreting my dreams. Now, I personally do 10-day sequences. So I work in dream sequences. I've got particular things I'm working on. So I tend to sit down every 10 days and review my dreams and see like what I can gain from them with that kind of cluster method that I kind of talked about earlier, and seeing, and you'd be shocked at the patterns that will come out, at least for me. Yeah. So we can talk maybe a little bit about why I think this works. And I think it's because of the Jungian, like, I think what happens with humans is like, no one really, like, we have to talk about representational thinking, like a thing being another thing. Like, so a story being essentially a tome of self-improvement. Like the hero goes and kills the dragon and then makes a sword out of it. And you can have a really Jungian interpretation of that, is like, you go and find your shadow and you take a part of it that's going to be useful for you, and you bring it back to the conscious mind and integrate that in your life. That would be a very Jungian interpretation of a myth. And yeah, that's kind of the classical way to work with your dreams in a Jungian context. Now he brings in, so if I'm working within a really rigid Jungian context right now, because I'm doing analysis with the Jungian, so they have the alchemical imagery. Jung was really into that, which is like essentially chemistry, right? Like you're looking at parts of your psyche, kind of dissolving it, forming it into something, and like making the elixir of life. So we're looking for that kind of imagery in the dreams. But yeah, it could literally be anything.
I just want to make sure that part of it is clear. You're looking for patterns that you can essentially map onto structures of the psyche. Is that roughly what you mean by the alchemy interpretation? Yeah.
So for example, okay, so let's talk about in a really rigorous Jungian context. And I think this goes back to kind of the Karl Popper point. Like, I think it's useful to say, like, hey, I'm going to go from point A to point B. And so Jung has this conception of individuation, which is taking these parts of your psyche and like molding them into what he would call the capital S self, which is conceptualized as a mandala. And they all look different, right? It's kind of a good symbol because like it's all the different colors of all the archetypes all coming into this kind of individual. It's actually quite interesting. I like it. But so like where I started, we're working with the shadow, right? And I was having this reoccurring dream of a giant creature. Like it was like kind of like a Pokemon. Like, you remember Pokemon?
Yeah.
Snorlax was this big fat thing that would just, it was kind of like that, but bigger, and it had this big round head, and it was kind of like the movie It Follows. Like, no matter where I went in the dream, it was just slowly coming at me. It's just terrifying. And so eventually I was like, okay, I'm going to kill it. I'm going to kill it. And so I grab a bat and I would just hit it as hard as I could, and it would just giggle at me and then follow me, and I would wake up just in a cold sweat. And then I was in Puerto Rico at the time, and I was telling the shaman that I was like, I can't beat this thing. And he was like, oh, like try hugging it. It's like, what? He's like, yeah, hug it. And so I did that. and the dream went away. And I kind of what I took from it was this: I need like it. One thing that's interesting about Jung is he started with work on the personality. And so like, if you look at my personality type, like one thing I have to work on is like kind of, the thing I have the least preference for is, the world of like like structure and like, so the giant was just kind of this representation of just this perseverance, just kind of walking forward and just making steady progress, reading 5-10 pages a day and not reading 30 books at once, for example, like finishing things. That was my an experience I had with the shadow. So now I'm working on one with the anima. I keep having these random dreams about like drowning, like or falling. Like so one will be, there's this. I'm locked in a castle in the basement in a tower, and I climb all the way up the tower, and there's a woman who is reaching down from this circle in the sky. And as soon as I reach, I fall to my death. And there's another one where I'm on a boat and I get dragons sink the boat. And there's a woman in a boat in the distance. And this is a strange one. I can't get there because I keep drowning, and I keep making a deal with a frog that it's like, I'll let you breathe. I'll let you breathe if you turn into a doll. And so I keep agreeing to turn into the doll because it's so painful to drown. Like it's like I'm lucid at the time, but I'm drowning and it's like hurting. And I think like the Jungian interpretation would be just to die. And I just can't do it. I just keep waking up. I agree to be turned into this doll by this frog. It's really odd dream. It's happened like 4 times. And yeah. And so through the I'm sorry, what was your original question? I think I kind of circled away from it. I was talking about
I don't remember.
The alchemy thing. So the alchemy thing with the anima is water is this kind of it kind of, so you start with like what's called calcination, and it's a fire dream, and not necessarily a dream, but it's a kind of burning away the impurities. And it's with the anima, that one's pretty simple to work with. It's kind of like the looking at the libido. So the conception of, and this is really prevalent if you really think about it, is kind of the feminine as kind of a sexual object for procreation. So we need to through fire. It's really interesting metaphor, especially if you look with witches who are talking about and kind of the burning of witches. It's pretty rich. So you start there, but then water is kind of, you end up with this kind of ash, and the water kind of forms it in some way. So it's what I'm trying to get at is it's a good sign for the alchemicals, in the alchemical sense, to be working with the water. And so if you're in, and I don't think this is the framework you need to work within. It's just I'm particularly interested in the classical Jungian, so that's what I'm working in. So I guess I kind of diverted from. I hope like this is one reason why I think it's interesting to remember your dreams, because you can do this kind of stuff. So if you want to move to the next step with lucid dreaming, the kind of tech before bed is this. Like, okay, so actually, let's say this. So you need to have your kind of reality checks built into the day. So we talked about like the medium of dreaming. Now we have to talk about kind of the medium of being awake. And this is just kind of, you can just adapt some like classic mindfulness stuff. It's like, okay, like a really helpful one actually is anytime you change a state, to just pause for a second and just like take a breath, like, and recognize that I'm moving and like where you're going. So like,
what do you mean by change of state?
So when after this conversation, I'm going to get up from the chair and walk somewhere. So you'll say like, as I move, we're like almost like a theater. Like every time you change a setting, as long as you're doing it about 10, 15 times a day, you're giving yourself these like anchor points of this is how my day went. Like this is what reality was for me, which actually, if you really think about it, if you try to, and the reason I'm getting this is because when we sit down or we lay down for bed, we're going to replay that. Every check you have, you're going to replay that. So you know where you are during a day. So when you repeat that and there's a freaking, I don't know, the Star of Bethlehem up to your right, and you're like, wait, that wasn't there when I did my mindfulness check. Am I awake? That can be actually really helpful. And it's actually good for just anxiety as well and like time management, etc.
So wait, hold on. So throughout your day, you do these sort of ritualistic reality checks.
Yes.
Hey, am I dreaming right now? And then when you go to sleep, you run through them.
Yeah, you go backwards.
You go backwards through your day to kind of remembering them.
Yeah, and then this is a kind of advanced technique, but I'll just say it because, and I've had some success with people doing it. If you want to re-enter the dream from the night before, like you go backwards through your day and then you kind of fall into the dream because you woke up from the dream. That's an advanced technique, but it'll work once we get there, once we practice a little. But does that make sense? So you kind of go back to waking up and you actually run through the remembering of the dream, which is really helpful because that kind of encodes that that's something you do. Like, to the prefrontal cortex, because now it's kind of fading off as you're falling asleep, but it's kind of in this liminal hypnagogic state. And you notice like so hypnagogia, I'm sure most of your listeners have had this experience where you're kind of awake, but not really. And you kind of have these kind of like weird, almost daydreams. And those tend to be remembered a lot easier. Like, that was weird. Like you tend to remember, it happens a lot in napping for people. And that's because you kind of have this kind of prefrontal cortex is sort of awake. So it's kind of colored usually by your room in some ways. Like it's kind of, for a lot of people, it's like they see something in their room that's kind of silly or something like that. Or like lots of colors or sounds are associated with it. I don't know. Have you ever experienced like someone calling your name as you're going to sleep? Like, William.
Mm-hmm.
That happens to a lot of people, strangely. And they'll just kind of jolt awake. There's also this thing called the exploding head syndrome. You just hear a bang and it just kind of wakes you up out of hypnagogic experience. It's very odd. But anyways, with the recounting of the day, you want to go through the day, through your reality checks, and just kind of the technique in classic Verdanda, I think is how you say it, meditation, is noting. It's just like, it's kind of subtle. There's a good app called Headspace, which is free. You could check it out if you're really into it. It sounds really simple, but it's actually somewhat difficult. It's just to okay, I'm sitting here. This is where I'm at. This is where I'm going. And another layer onto it is what is primary right now? Is there a thought that's primary? Is there an emotion that's primary? Like you can layer, is this positive or negative? You can do all kinds of things with that, but just to start with, we want to just note things. And like I said, I'm really into it, so I do it throughout the day. But even if we can just get one or two, that'll be really helpful. Food works. I think the restroom works really well. And then I kind of, on top of that, layer different things in. So you have the classic one about your hands. Like you kind of look at your hands and say, am I sleeping? And then look up, which is a little quirky, but it's kind of interesting because your hands are so primary to your experience that you're really connected to them in some way. So when something's really odd about them, like there's a hole in it, like it is jarring, but it's just kind of like, there's like a pause there in the dream for some reason. There's like, it's like so immediate to you that it can be a really good vector into a lucid dream. Does that make sense?
That's the only technique that I've tried, and it's worked really well for me. Yeah. So I've lucid dreamed a bunch of times, but mostly it's been an accident. Just like one day I happened to lucid dream. Yeah. But the only times that I've been able to do it intentionally were using the hand method. So I just throughout the day, I made a point. I'm not in the habit of it anymore. I'm trying to get in the habit of it again. But I was in the habit of just like throughout the day, I just look at my hands. Like, they look normal. I guess I'm awake. And I just, after doing it a long time, a few times it happened that I would be dreaming and be like, oh, they are wiggly. I guess I'm dreaming. I was surprised at how quickly that worked for me. I thought that would have to be a practice of like a long time, but I tried it just for like a week and it worked.
Yeah, I was going to say that it tends to work within about a week because in it, like, I don't think people realize how much they're dreaming in a night, and you're going to catch a glimpse of your hands. Like if you're observing yourself moving through the world, you're going to catch a glimpse because it's just so visceral to you, and it's really powerful. I do think, like you said, it can be really difficult to remember. So, and me, like, I'm the kind of person that loses days very easily, like just loses them completely. Like it will be late. I'll get lost in a book or something. So it is important for me to like be somewhat regimented. So I do like these 25-minute blocks, 25-minute blocks, and then go and take a walk. And so those become like really natural points for me. And then I do the same kind of walk. So that, yeah. And you know, you don't have to, you can like, you can work in 10-day periods. Like you can be really regimented for like 3 days, like especially if you layer a fast or something onto it for whatever reason. Fasting, I think there's science behind it, but like if you regiment your day like for 1 day and do a fast, and you can usually have a really powerful experience from that in itself, and kind of that's a good entry point into it. But yeah, kind of having these points where you are just, you know, when you're going to lay down that you have that to kind of anchor onto. And I try to say to people, because it does seem like a lot to do, like layer on, like make it a trophic cascade of self-improvement, like get more water, take walks, meditate. Like most people want to do that anyways. If you can use like lucid dreaming as the, like, I don't know, like the apple on the rod, like I think the metaphor I'm going for is like, oh, the carrot on the stick. I think that's cool, you know? Yeah. And then kind of the other technique from there is, okay, so then you've got to do this interesting thing with the senses. The technique is called sense-induced lucid dreaming. And so you've gone kind of through your day. Like at this point, I'm falling asleep before this process a lot. But if not, because for a lot of people, they're really stimulated by this. So you have this thing where you kind of, from that McEwen sense about perception, like you engage with sight, like on its own terms, like as your eyes are closed. And that seems kind of subtle, but you just kind of, I just invite people to try it, like as kind of a meditative exercise, like just kind of sit with the perception of sight on its own terms, separated from all other experience. It's pretty remarkable, the idea of sight. And then you go to the same thing for sound, and the same thing for like a somatic, like touch, like really touch the bed, for example, and the pillow, like really like sit with that. And you kind of do a couple cycles of that, and let's say 10, and you should be asleep, but if you're not, then you can kind of count backwards from 1,000. You should be asleep very quickly, usually, I find. And then what the kind of the classic, and this is, I think, where it loses a lot of people, but if you kind of want to guarantee yourself a lucid dream, what you do is you set your alarm for, like, let's say 90 minutes from that point, wake up, and like if I'm really struggling to get into a lucid dream, I'll do like sun salutation or like some form of exercise for 10 minutes and then go back to sleep. And almost universally from that, people are just right into a dream, because I think it's something to do with how disorienting it is to your brain, perhaps. But yeah, if you do that process, which just is not sustainable for life, it's really disruptive to do that step. That's kind of how you almost guarantee it. Yeah, but I think in what I suggest doing from the remembering dreams to that process, like in descending order, I think all of them will enrich your life and make your dream life like potentially really valuable. If you really are set on having a lucid dream, you can layer in the waking up. And there's even, I'm not going to suggest any, but there are substances that you can do Google research on then buy on Amazon. I don't know where you're watching from, so that's why I'm not going to suggest them. But yeah, there's interesting plant allies, let's say, that you can use as well if you're really set on just experiencing it just once or whatever, or just want to try it out. Yeah, those would be my suggestions.
That's really that's awesome. Thank you. I have one more question for you.
Okay.
So let's say you lucid dream, and this I find kind of interesting. And I want to hear both your sort of interpretation and also your suggestion about what you do when you lucid dream. So there's something kind of interesting about lucid dreaming that I found from my own experience, is that it's extremely liberating because you now are aware of what's going on. So you can kind of, you have free will, let's put it that way. You also kind of there's an extent to which you have no limits, right? Like there's no long-term consequences here, go nuts. So first of all, I think it's interesting to note what we choose to do when we're in that circumstance. When we're in a circumstance where we realize, oh crap, no consequences, I can do whatever I want, here I go. It's interesting to see what it is that we do. Yeah. And then there's also just the question of when you're in that situation where you're pretty much, not entirely, but you're pretty much omnipotent, what should you want to do? I mean, so my own experience with that has been I'm surprised at the sort of simple pleasures that I choose to go to when I lucid dream. Yeah. I think every time I've ever lucid dreamed, I have always decided that the thing to do is either to fly or have sex. Yeah. It's just, that's, and which weirdly seems almost like, a little boring. I wish I was doing something more creative. But the other thing that I think is interesting, sorry, this is a long question, but when I have lucid dreamed, and I wonder if you've had an experience like this as well, I'm aware of the fact that I'm dreaming, and so I know I can kind of do whatever I want. But sometimes, not every time, but sometimes there are these like these things that get in the way. Sort of like I'll have a kind of goal, and I feel like I can do whatever I want, but something is kind of stopping me nonetheless. So one example that I've had is jumping. I want to jump really, really high, and I feel like because I'm lucid dreaming I can, but actually I can't. Something is making it so that my jumps aren't going that high. So yeah, sorry, that's kind of like a multi-part question, but I'll let you touch on some of those things.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned the flight and sex thing, because you can read some of the reports from Stanford, and they train people how to lucid dream, and it's nearly universal. Like everyone goes there. I think that's actually really interesting, and that's an interesting thing to examine. But and so I can tell you, like, this is kind of funny. Okay, so have you heard of the self-improvement guru Tim Ferriss? 4-Hour Workweek. Okay, yeah. He had a really interesting experiment he did where he's good at lucid dreaming, and he got way better at wrestling. So he went from in college, he went from like 500, like 15 to 29 and 4 or something. And what he did was he watched videos of this world champion or Olympic wrestler in the Olympics, and every night he wrestled him. He wrestled that guy and just got destroyed, and started slightly getting better. And that can be really interesting. And this is something, so I'm doing Jungian analysis right now. You need to do 100 hours. And I'm arguing right now with the analyst that because I do lucid dreaming, I do depth psychology with Carl Jung in my dreams. And I'm saying it should count. And they're like, and this is so classically Jungian, they're like determining if they should count half of it or none of it. But they know they can't count all of it. I'm like, what? That's ridiculous. But another thing a lot of musicians use it to practice. I mean, so creatively, I think. And so one thing that I noticed, like I'll try to practice writing, and I'll be writing. I think this touches on your other points, but like, so I'm pretty, a lot of my thought, it leans more towards like the more animist, like the fact that we're the kind of fourth dimensional interpretation that I kind of was talking about, as opposed to like what I would call like a Neoplatonic interpretation. And as I'm writing about this in my dreams, trying to get ideas, like these Neoplatonic figures will emerge and start like arguing with me and distracting me from writing, and make like excellent points that like it's hard for me to like to like it actually it makes me self-conscious about writing. So I don't think like lucid dreaming, I think you have to look at, so my interpretation of that would not be that like these figures are coming up from the unconscious and chatting with me. I think they are projections of my own psyche onto them. The reason I think that is because the analysis with Jung has improved exponentially as I've read more of his work. It's gotten better and I've had more success with it. So I think it is a projection of kind of the inputs, which is kind of cool because it means that like you don't have to highlight as much, right? Like you can just read. I mean, you know, like you just consume more and work with it through that. But I've noticed, yeah, so I think that touches on the point you made about like figures within the psyche, because my interpretation would be kind of develop your psyche. Like, well, the nice thing about dreams is you can talk to those figures. Like you can say, come out and like, why are you, you know, if you're lucid dreaming, like, hey, why are you doing this? And one thing from a therapeutic, in my experience, a helpful thing, if you're interacting with dream characters and they're like harming you, it's like, you seem like a nice thing. Like, what would you rather be doing? And usually it's like a repressed thing that would rather like get love or something. It's like something really odd like that. Yeah. So, they won't come out necessarily. So like, I'll just share one experience. Like I was really struggling for months with remembering dreams. Like after I got through the giant thing, like they shut off. I couldn't remember them. I couldn't lucid dream for like months. And it was really frustrating. And so I started waking up with just no memory. And I just started doing the process I was talking about. I just started making it up completely and just created a kind of mythos for myself based on the frustration of not remembering. And then I started dreaming of those characters. And the obstacles in my psyche started conforming to the obstacles in the stories, which was really useful. So, and you can be more creatively, if you're interested in creative output, that killed two birds with one stone, right? And there's something about what I kind of been talking about since the beginning about this mythopoetic, this process of making the subjective experience objective is like an olive branch to your conscious mind in some ways. And it seems as if you can start getting into kind of like almost like I would use like surfing almost as like a metaphor. It's like accepting both of those as conscious part, not necessarily conscious, but as a legitimate, if they each have a legitimate role, it tends to work out better. So it's like from a remembering standpoint and kind of a utility standpoint. So yeah, does that cover what you?
Yeah. I have, sorry, just one more question. I said one more question last time.
Okay.
You've alluded to dangers of lucid dreaming.
Yeah.
What are those?
Okay, so the big one is I think I'm not convinced. So not to go down a whole nother tangent, but I'm really interested in the biological substrate, like as like the biological mechanisms as like a substrate for consciousness almost. And I think there's this thing called the limbic deep, I think very deep, like where procedural memory is. So walking, like you don't know how you walk. You can't remember that. It's procedural. It's not, that is, I think that actually can be accessed. And I think it's pretty, like that you don't want to mess that up, right? Like, because there's going to be no help for you. Like, you're not going to be able to say to the doctor, like, they're going to say you can't access your procedural memory. So if you, like, I haven't observed this happening, but like, say your left foot stops working. Like, I think that is actually a legitimate danger with this kind of work as you progress. And like anytime you're searching, like if you have a knack for it, anytime you're the explorer, like we talked about the falling off place, that like somebody's got to fall off, right? So like the further you go, the more likely you are to be the example of what not to do to learn something, which is heroic in many senses, but it's also dangerous. So like, yeah, you know, if something's really resisting, like sometimes you might want to back off. That's what I say. And like figure out why, like consciously, because it might be that you're going too deep into procedural memory and you just don't want to muck around there. I would say that. And then you just kind of have, like you were talking about earlier with this kind of paradoxical aspect of becoming conscious being kind of proliferating unconsciousness almost. And I think if sometimes things are repressed for a reason, and like it's not always helpful for your job, say, to have a floods of negative emotion all day. So we do have this kind of reality that we're living in, and I don't know. So I think there can be a tendency to, because I think the dream process is so personal, it is effective, but we can also be ignorant, or at least I can be ignorant of how much, like to me, it's like heal all of it right now. Like, and if you give yourself the power to do that, you might do it. And be careful what you ask for. If that means 1 week of laying in bed, say, and if you've been repressing something for like, say, 15, 20 years, like that's not unreasonable. And then you're kind of the difficulty or the drawbacks of individual work is you're individual. So that now if you have a problem, you now have bursts of negative emotion. Then now you're going to, it may say you'll need help. And now you're going from a place of like, you know, perhaps you've given yourself symptoms of something that you don't have, and who are you going to talk to? And you're not necessarily going to be rational about these kind of decisions. I would say that would be the biggest dangers of it. I wouldn't say be super terrified by it unless you're like one of these people that already have a problem with like thrill seeking, because most of us are going to get a taste of negative emotion and back off. But if you've had experiences with like, say, what some would call irrational behavior going wrong for you, like crashing motorcycles or something, like you might want to be safe with it, or you might want to calibrate your risk tolerance first. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it sounds like some of those dangers kind of
pretty self-evident.
Yeah, the warning signs are gonna come with the experience as you go. It sounds like.
Yeah, and you know, I would say like make it try to like, if you're gonna do dreaming out, like if you're gonna try to improve yourself, like start with things like don't fix your childhood first. Like, so I'm really interested in a Piagetian, who's this childhood development guy, like building an optimized Piagetian development for myself, going back and re-experiencing it. You don't need to necessarily start with that. Like start with like, hey, like what would I have to do to have really good nutrition? What would I have to do to like have exercise? Like the stuff that is going to like steel you against depression in the first place. Like, cause like why is like, I think that's a good place to start. And then you can kind of build a buffer. And then you could dive in, like you can demonstrate to yourself that one, it's effective for you. So if you're like, why can't I meditate? Why can't I eat well? And why can't I sleep well? Like, let's figure that out using this system of self-development. If it works, then you're going to find yourself in a position where you now have a technique and you also have kind of a buffer against, like, let's say psychosis, because something that amplifies negative emotion is like not getting enough sleep, not eating well, not exercising. So then you can kind of steal yourself from it and put yourself. So that's something I did after I made the first mistake of like getting a flood of negative emotion. Somebody gave me that advice and was like, well, you don't really eat well. Like, why don't you start there? Because that's a huge dragon to slay. I mean, for almost all of us. I mean, that's a tough one. So that would be kind of my suggestion if you're really excited about it, but somewhat hesitant based on what I just said. Like, hey, like if this technique can't help you like eat well, or it's not going to help you with your much deeper stuff. So start there and get good at it, and then you kind of have the network effect of being more psychologically healthy and kind of ready to dive into the deeper stuff.
Cool. All right, man. This has been a hell of a discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, man.
Have a good night.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber. Next week, I'll argue against the idea that there is anything we can be absolutely certain about. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.